what is Wagner? How did they even become in a position to do what they're doing? Let's just start by defining what the company even is in the first place.
Sure. Well, in classic Wagnerian sense or Russian sense, Wagner as an entity with the name Wagner doesn't exist. It is not a legal entity. There's no company out there whose name is Wagner Group. Wagner is a catch-all term or nickname that developed, and we can go into how that developed, for a network of companies affiliated with Yevgeny Prigozhin, as well as some other individuals, his co-founder, Dimitri Utkin. And it first developed, this network of companies first emerged in eastern Ukraine around 2014, during the first outbreak of war in Ukraine. And
yeah, I was just going to say, what else happened in 2014 in Ukraine? Anything of note?
Exactly. And so essentially what happened was you had this guy, Dimitri Utkin, who's a career soldier, a paratrooper, fought in Chechnya, and then kind of became involved in private security, first going to Syria with a prior private military company, Slavonic Corps, who is a neo-Nazi and a huge fan of the 19th century German composer Wagner. And he essentially shows up in eastern Ukraine with a bunch of other volunteers or mercenaries, most likely part of the Russian government's covert effort at the time to support a local rebellion that quickly turned into a war that could not have been a war without Moscow's assistance to these local forces. And Dimitri Utkin is one of those guys who shows up ostensibly as a volunteer, but as we learned later, part of this forming group of different mercenary companies that became useful to the Kremlin, especially within the context of a covert war in eastern Ukraine.
It's interesting that somebody who's a neo-Nazi is also a Russian nationalist, right? Because my history is not great, but I do vaguely remember learning that the Nazis and the Russians were not on the same side in World War II. So what the heck is going on here?
Yeah, I mean, there's really no way to kind of try and square that one. Yeah, and I'm not going to come to the defense of Utkin with some sort of logic about how it actually all works out perfectly. But I think what we can say that I think is interesting is that the guys who wind up in these positions, the guys who wind up being mercenaries, military contractors, these types of people, there does tend to be a tendency for these groups to overlap and certainly flirt with white nationalism, neo-Nazi ideology. Very often we kind of find the same types of people, very different structures and governments and cultural contexts, but very often the people who fall into these categories within each country have a tendency to share some ideologies, and white nationalism is certainly one of them. Same with soccer hooliganism. A lot of Wagner guys came from the kind of the hooligan, huge soccer fans of, say, St. Petersburg's football team or soccer team, Zenit. A lot of these guys have come out of, I would say, kind of general fans of guns and training, self-defense, martial arts, MMA, all of these kind of small cultures, niche. I wouldn't call white nationalism niche, but like all of these kind of milieu and cultures also feed into.
There's a fancy word you don't often hear associated with Nazis. Yeah, that's interesting.
You told me to bring it in beforehand to work one word in that. Yeah.
Yeah, you nailed it. That's really funny. It does make sense, right? It's kind of like the tough guy who beat people up in the street outside of a soccer game because he's a punk loser with nothing to do, goes to the MMA gym and decides to be a career gangster criminal, and then the state needs gangster criminals that are willing to kill people for money, and they're like, hey, this is the only thing that I really have any skills in doing, and then they join this organization, and it doesn't really matter that they're also a neo-Nazi because the logic doesn't have to square. They just need to be willing to be violent for rubles, and that's the end of it.
And at the end of the day, I mean, this portion makes up and made up certainly at that time a pretty vocal and central component of Wagner Group, but certainly not all mercenaries within Wagner Group hold this ideology. And certainly as it expanded, you saw far and far less people with that type of ideology. I think probably like everywhere else, the biggest feeder for folks working for these types of companies is that you have a huge pool of guys with military experience who come out of the army and very often are bored and want to relive some of that adventure, and they're not happy just sitting as a mall cop or the mall cop equivalent in Russia. These types of opportunities to go abroad again, to participate in events is sometimes, and frankly, just the money is something that can be very attractive to the guys who have this type of experience.
So they recruit from the military, but it sounds like they also recruited a bunch of people from prisons. And I think some people know this, but let's speak to that a little bit, because they had this huge number of soldiers in Wagner. They lost like 20,000 of them in Bakhmut, but then somewhere during that battle, they needed to replenish their numbers. And they went to prisons and essentially emptied them out of able-bodied guys from the sound of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think essentially what happened was, at least kind of initially during the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, Wagner was actually initially sidelined by other guys in the Ministry of Defense, his old nemesis Shoigu, who wanted to bring in his own private military companies, his own private armies, who were more closely affiliated with him. So when the war in Ukraine broke out, actually last year, on February 24th, 2022, Prigozhin's guys, Wagner, were nowhere to be seen. It was really only after the Russian military started facing some setbacks that they were forced to go to Wagner. And the reason that they were forced to go to Wagner is because a private military company is essentially, at the end of the day, a logistics company. It is a company that is contracting, and its job is to move men and material to places that people need them, the people who are paying. And so Wagner is as good as its Rolodex. It's as good as the spreadsheets of people with contact numbers who they can call up and recruit and get manpower. And that's what the Russian government, all of a sudden, about a month into the war, needed to tap into. And that's how Prigozhin got back in. And he initially brought in a lot of very talented guys because, contrary to, say, the Russian military and soldiers just in the Russian military, these guys had about 8 years of experience fighting in eastern Ukraine in 2014 and 2015, fighting in Syria, Libya, Africa. I mean, these were talented guys. And so they initially made a big difference. But like you said, he started losing a lot of those guys. And it became necessary in general for the Russian government to bring more men to the front line. And one of the solutions, we don't know whose idea it was, but it would seem typically Prigozhin, was to go to Russian penal colonies with an offer. And we can talk a little bit about what that offer was, because it was very interesting.
So I would love to talk about that offer, because I think I would take a pretty low ball if I was going to die in a Russian prison or spend the next decade in there, because prison in the United States, notoriously terrible. Prison in Russia has got to be even worse probably by a lot, especially if you're in, I don't know, Siberia or someplace that's not near Moscow. I would imagine it's as close to a living hell as you can get outside of, North Korea or something. So to say, hey, remember when you killed somebody and you went to prison? How about now you kill somebody and you get out of prison? And they're like, well, what's the, sure, where do I sign? I mean, that's what I would say if I'm in their shoes.